Welcome to the Science of Sports Performance, where we discuss the real science of nutrition and exercise, helping you train smarter, fuel better, and perform at your very best.
My name is Ben Pressler, and I'm currently an undergraduate student at Brigham Young University, majoring in both nutritional and exercise sciences. I'm pursuing my PhD with the goal of becoming a professor of sports nutrition. Today's episode, we are going to be talking about the squat, bench, and deadlift. Today's episode 6, and our last episode, episode 5, we talked about powerlifting, we talked about maximal strength and neural adaptations, we talked about a specific set of programming that I used to prepare for and do pretty well at a powerlifting meet that I competed in. And after I uploaded last episode, episode 5, I realized that I wish I could have gone into a little better detail about the lifts themselves, the squat, the bench, and the deadlift. There's actually a lot to learn about these lifts, all about the proper form to use, the technique and the rules that you need to follow throughout the meet, as well as some of the equipment that you can use to help you do better, some of the accessory movements you can use to train these movements. Now, our last episode, I think, was a couple hours long, but for me to have gone into more detail about the squat, the bench, and the deadlift in and of themselves, I think would have taken just about equally as long. So we could consider it part 2 to that episode, or I guess a mini series about powerlifting. But however you want to consider it, today we're going to be talking about the squat, bench, and the deadlift. I'm just going to go from floor to ceiling, talk about as much as I can to teach you guys how you can most effectively master these lifts and perform as best as you possibly can. So in today's episode, expect to learn, again, about those 3 big lifts, the squat, the bench, and the deadlift. I will teach you about the proper technique, the mechanics, and the muscles involved, cues you can use as you perform the lift to do better, equipment that you're allowed to use, accessory movements that will help you train those exercises, and then at the very end, I want to talk about some ergogenic aids that we can use to perform better. Those are things like smelling salts, loud music, stomping, screaming to psych ourselves up, things that we can do to give ourselves that extra little bit of energy to hopefully perform better. We'll be talking about whether or not those actually work, and we'll just going over a paper for each of them. Let's go ahead and get into it. We're going to start, of course, with the squat. In a powerlifting meet, again, for any of those who might not be familiar, because there hopefully are lots of you who are interested in learning about this topic just because you lift recreationally and you want to perform as best as you can at these lifts just for the sake of your own enjoyment. Maybe you're not a competitive powerlifter, but in a competitive powerlifting meet, you perform the squat and then the bench press and then the deadlift. So we're going to go in that order today. The squat, now you guys are all familiar with what the squat is. You put the weight on your back, you squat it down, and you get it back up, right? I'm not going to go into that remedial of information level for you guys today. But in the squat, of course, the primary muscle that we're going to be using is the quads as well as the glutes, right? The quads contribute to knee extension, the glutes contribute to hip extension, and those are really the main drivers there. You could make a case for the calves being a part of that, that triple extension, because your ankle joint does flex a little bit in the squat, and then you will extend it up. There's a little bit of range of motion there in the calf, but frankly, the calf is much more of a supporting, stabilizing muscle for the squat. Definitely not the big driver there. That's just going to be your quads and your glutes. It's also worth mentioning the adductors. The adductors play a huge role. The adduction is bringing your limbs into anatomical position. So in your legs, the adductors are what bring your legs from a spread out stance to close together. That would be anatomical if you were standing straight up. And so, especially depending on how wide of a stance you take in your squat, which is something that we'll go into a little bit just here next. But especially as you do a wider squat, some people would consider it a sumo squat. But the wider you go, the more you're going to use your adductors, because as you go down in that range of motion, your knees are going to abduct from your body, and you need to adduct them back in. So yeah, especially if you haven't squatted for a while, you might be able to kind of feel your adductors more so than you have. Actually, some of you might be familiar with Greg O'Gallagher. He's a fitness influencer, one of the more originals. Anyways, he has this philosophy. I followed it for a little while ago when I was probably 18 or 19 years old. Um, he doesn't really train his legs, at least not with like heavy squats and heavy deadlifts. But I mean, he trains them, right? Not chicken legs. I don't want to make it sound like I'm calling bad on Greg, but he just prioritizes aesthetics more than anything, I think, and he wants to have like athletic legs. And so in his program that he puts out, the one that I followed for a little while, he does Bulgarian split squats, which are a unilateral exercise. So you're working one leg at a time, and because of that, there's no abduction or adduction of your legs throughout that movement. And before, I loved to do heavy back squats, but I wanted to try the Bulgarian split squats and things for a little while. Eventually, I decided I didn't like it, and I wanted to go back to doing my squats. And when I returned to that, I couldn't do near as heavy the weight as I used to be able to, just because I felt like my adductors were so weak and underused. And so they were a big component of my squat, at least at that time. And I don't know. I've never had that experience since, so maybe they still are a very big component of my squat nowadays, but I just don't know. Anyways, when I hadn't trained my adductors in that way for a long time, my squat really kind of suffered. So the adductors, long way of me saying that the adductors definitely play a role into your back squat. The lower back as well, of course, that is going to depend as well on your bar height, how much your lower back comes into play there. But for everyone, you are going to need to use your lower back, your back extensors to maintain the uprightness of your torso with that heavy weight on it. We already talked about your calves, kind of as a supporting element of the squat. And then, of course, your arms and your shoulders are going to come into play bracing. So that shouldn't be super fatiguing on your arms necessarily, but as we'll get into later, some people wear wrist wraps to kind of help support their wrists as they are bracing with their arms for that back squat, as well as some people really feel like their brace, just holding that heavy weight up on their back during their back squat, kind of can affect their bench press. I don't really feel like that personally, but some people do, and that's totally okay. Moving on, I mean, of course, we talked about all the muscles there of the mechanics of the squats. Of course, the femur is really going to be, is the bone that kind of connects all this. So your knee joint, your hip joint are the two joints in play, really, and then your femur really is the bone that is moving during this squat, right? So it's worth mentioning, everyone squats a little differently, right? We can talk about averages, we can talk about how things normally go, but everyone's biomechanics and lever lengths of their body, be it your legs for your squat and your deadlift, be it your arms for your bench press, or whatever the lift is, are going to be a little different, and people are going to sometimes struggle because of that. Sometimes they're going to have a big advantage because of that. And a great example actually is my wife and I. My wife and I actually have pretty similar length legs. She's 5'7", so that's 5 inches shorter than me. But our legs are actually pretty much the same length. She has very, very long femurs, and for that reason, squatting is a lot harder for her. So if you think about that, the longer the femur, kind of the more distance you have to move that weight, the more work is done in the system of that barbell, that weight makes your squat a little harder. Whereas if someone has short femurs, that range of motion gets cut pretty short because of that. They're able to stay very, very upright, and so their femur length comes into play in a big way right there. Moving into the technique of the squat, the rules for a powerlifting squat are simply that your hip joint needs to pass below your knee joint. So that is slightly, some people squat to 90 degrees, and obviously that's super limited range of motion squat. Some people squat to the point where their femur is parallel with the ground. So in this powerlifting squat, it's actually going to be slightly below parallel. So that hip joint needs to come below the knee joint. And that's all the rule is. But then the technique of how we can make this squat most effective, the first thing you should know is that you want to keep the barbell, the weight, over your midfoot. So just think about your foot, right? Maybe you are familiar with this and maybe you're not, but you have the ball of your foot at the front, right by your toes. You have the heel of your foot. You kind of have your side of your foot, your your outside of your foot kind of touches the ground, and then you have your arch in the middle. The inside of your arch probably doesn't touch the ground so much, right? So the mid foot is actually kind of going to be the front of that arch, kind of where the ball and the arch come together. And again, of course, depending on your feet, maybe some people have long feet or shorter feet or different feet, but really it's going to be about at that arch, the top of that arch or the front of the arch. And you want to keep the bar over that because that's going to be the middle of your base of support, right? Of course, your feet are what's supporting you throughout this squat. You want to keep that weight right above the middle so that you are as sturdy as possible. And if it comes off of that midline, the weight, then you can kind of fall forward, fall backward, get kind of unstable, and it's really going to kind of be at the detriment of your squat. With that in mind, we should discuss a high bar squat versus a low bar squat. So high bar and low bar has to do with where you rest the weight on your back. Now, there's kind of pros and cons of both, but first thing I want to address, like I said, with keeping that bar over the midline of your foot is the distance of, how do I say this? The distance of that barbell from your hip joint, right? So if that barbell is actually very, very close to your hip joint, you might actually have to lean over really, really far to keep that barbell over that midline where you want it to be during your squat. And so that could really, really be taxing on your lower back and your back extensors. So if that's kind of a weak point for you, maybe you've experienced injuries and struggles with that sometimes before, then you might want to consider doing a higher or a high bar back squat. The thing about a high bar back squat is it's that greater distance from your hip joint, which in one sense means that there's a longer range of motion, right? A longer lever. Same way with your femurs that we just talked about. You know, the longer that lever is, technically the harder it's going to be. So a lot of people feel like they can go a lot heavier on a low bar back squat. However, the thing is you're going to be able to maintain much more of an upright posture. And with that more upright posture, your lower back extensors are not going to be quite as limiting as they are with a lower back squat. So you really kind of have to feel it out. I would not say I'd necessarily do a high bar squat or necessarily do a low bar squat. I anchor the bar on the bottom of my traps. So kind of where my traps and my shoulders meet, there's kind of like that natural groove, right, in your back muscles. I like to rest the barbell just right there. That is probably just considered traditional. High bar would be when the squat bar is kind of on top of your traps, sitting and pushing down on them. And a low bar squat was when you go much lower than that natural kind of crease in your back. You go a lot lower, and again, there's pros and there's cons to both. I really would recommend just doing a traditional squat and then kind of going from there and feeling it out, what you like to do. If you like to do a little higher or you like to do a little lower, most people probably will just prefer a nice and traditional squat. Another thing to talk about with the squat is external hip rotation. So what you can think about there is kind of a narrow versus a wide stance squat. That's really going to be our biggest driver. I think it's called a cannonball squat. I haven't heard that phrase in a long time, so maybe that's outdated and people don't call it that anymore. But a squat where you have your feet right next to each other. I think the idea is right. You almost like you're squatting on top of a cannonball, and it is very quad dominant because to get full depth, your knees have to bend a very, very great range of motion. So it's quad dominant squat, cannonball squat. If you go out and you do a lot wider of a squat, just think about this with me. If you were to keep your feet parallel with each other, the wider and the wider you get, your ankles really aren't going to be able to support that in terms of their rotation, and it's going to be kind of awkward. So usually how it goes is the wider you put your feet, the more externally you rotate your feet. So that is just taking your toes, rotating them out so that, the reason for it is so that your hips and your femurs kind of just don't get in each other's way, if that kind of makes any sense. You should try it out, really. If you're kind of confused what I'm saying, go get, I don't know, not too much weight on the bar, but try it out, like with your different, foot angles, and your different widths and everything, you'll notice like if you were to do a cannonball squat as I've described, you're going to get to a point where it kind of feels like your hips and your legs are fighting into each other, they're getting in each other's way. And so if you were even from a cannonball squat, just to rotate your feet outwards and have this big angle of rotation of your feet. Whoa, one thing I should make sure to say is that when you squat, you want to keep your knees going in the same direction as your toes, right? So some people will say, oh, you can't externally rotate your feet. That's bad for you. It's not bad for you at all if your knees go in that direction, right? So if your knees and your feet are going in different directions, that is bad for you. You should stop that. You should figure out what you're doing. But as long as your knees and your feet are going in that same direction, even from that very, very narrow squat, you'll notice that that kind of goes away. It's a little easier to hit that range of motion. And that's really what that tool is, that external rotation of your hip. It's something that I do. It's something that I really recommend to people who do have long femurs. So my wife, for example, she really likes to go pretty wide on her squat because, well, if you think about it, if you look at it, a squat from a side profile, the more you externally rotate your legs, when you get to the bottom of that squat, you will have externally rotated your femurs. And then that kind of technically from a side profile view makes that femur shorter. Now it's not literally actually shorter because you still have to, contract your muscles to move that bone over that same length regardless of where it is. But if you look at from that side profile, that bottom of that squat, which can be very valuable to do and optimize, then you've shortened that lever arm a little bit, making that squat a little easier because of that external rotation of your hips. It's not something that you have to do, but it is something that I'd recommend. When I squat, I take about a 30-degree external rotation. So if my feet were parallel from each other, I personally, on my heels, rotate them about 30 degrees. And that's my ideal squat form. When you talk about squat width, I would not recommend doing that cannonball form, that really, really narrow squat, if your goal is to lift as much as possible, just because it's quad dominant, right? We want to try and find a balance of what is going to be working both of the major muscle groups, in this case the quads and the glutes, as much as possible, because if they're both being worked and utilized as much as possible, then hypothetically we'll be lifting as much weight as possible. Sometimes people will like to go really, really wide on their squat, and like I said, you could call that a sumo squat, and that is going to be more glute dominant. Some people like that because their glutes are a lot stronger than their quads and they feel like they do well in that regard. If that's the case, that's great. A lot of people will say shoulder width, but just to be a little more specific, what I like to do when I squat is to put my heels under my shoulders. So I've already mentioned that I rotate my toes a little bit outwards from my heels, but I like to keep my heels at shoulder width and then rotate my feet out. And again, if you're paying attention, that is going to put my base of support, the midline of my foot, a little bit outside of shoulder width. And that just feels really, really good for me. But again, my shins and my femurs and my feet and my everything is going to be slightly different proportions than yours are. And everyone else listening to this, right? We're all going to be a little different. So I hope to explain these principles to you well enough that you can kind of go and experiment. Now, as you're listening, please listen with an open mind, I should say. I actually don't consider myself having perfected my squat form until like 6 months ago. Genuinely. I've been in the gym and I've been lifting weights for years now, about 8 years. And that whole time, my squat form has been pretty bad. It actually took me several years as I was a teenager to get to the point where my squat was actually deep enough to count for anything. I, unknowingly, didn't squat very deep at all. And so my squats would not have counted really for anything. And then beyond that, I really struggled getting them to the right depth because it was easier for just me to squat all the way down. And that kind of made it trickier for me in figuring out my right, hip rotation and everything like that. It really took a long time. And for me to get to the point where I really felt like I had it down to that perfect science, perfect for me, was literally about 6 months ago. So the majority of my lifting career, I would not say that I've had a good squat. If you really feel like you have a perfect squat, then congrats. I mean, that's awesome. And maybe just you can keep some of this in mind of why your squat form is the way that it is. However, for a lot of people, even me 7 months ago, I would have valued to listen to some of this information and kind of apply it. So really try and think about some of these things. Next time you go during your warm-up sets for your squat, just try and be intentional and think about why you're squatting the way you're squatting and see if you could change anything. You know, some people really don't know why they squat the way they squat, and they just put their feet where they think they ought to and they go. And I mean, it's good to be intuitive with the way that you're going to move your body. There's a big thing to say about that. I don't mean to make anybody over-engineer their squat or anything like that, or any of these lifts. Really, I mean, if you are squatting pretty heavy, you take this heavy barbell off the rack, and then you have to spend a lot of time and mental energy getting everything just perfectly where it's supposed to be, then that is going to be to the detriment of your squat, whereas this information is supposed to be helpful for your squat. So again, I don't mean to help anyone overthink or over-engineer or overanalyze. Don't want paralysis by analysis, if you've heard that before. I just want to give you some tools and hopefully just keep it in mind and work a thing in or two until it's habit, and then hopefully you can get really good squat form from there. Another thing that you should be thinking about as you do your squat is thinking of your foot as a tripod. Now, I'm sure you've heard that triangles are the strongest shape. That's true, but why is that? Well, if you think about it, we live in a three-dimensional world, and so if you have something sitting on three legs, it is actually going to be perfectly balanced. So I'm sure some of you guys have had an experience with a desk or a chair at school or at work that just kind of doesn't quite sit right and it kind of wobbles. Maybe you shove a piece of paper that you folded up a few times under there to try and like level it out well. Well, that's because we don't live in a four-dimensional world. We live in a three-dimensional world. And so three of those legs are always going to meet each other really, really well to support whatever the object is. The fourth one, I mean, it could meet well, but it's not bound to be perfect, right? If you just have like a three-legged stool or a three-legged tower or a three-legged anything, it is always going to, all of the weight is going to be distributed well between those three bases of support. So think of your foot as a tripod, and those three bits of that tripod are going to be, first of all, your heel, and then they're going to be the two sides of the ball of your foot. So just visualize that. I mean, regardless of whether or not you visualize that, it's kind of going to be true, but when you can kind of visualize that and keep that in mind, really, we build from the ground up. So if you have a really, really strong support base on your squat or whatever it is, then we're only going to be able to work up from there. You can never be stronger than your base of support. So try and think about that, be intentional with that, get a really, really good support with your foot. Think of it as a tripod. The last thing I wanted to talk about is sticking points. So, I mean, every lift is going to have a sticking point. It's just where it's slowest, where it feels the heaviest. And usually what that has to do with is our leverages, right? So I hope you guys are all familiar with how a lever works. But when we're using a lever for the sake of mechanical advantage, the way it works is just that we are moving an object over a shorter distance with a lever that is a longer distance. So when you apply force at a longer distance than you're moving the object, you can apply less force than it would actually take to lift that object, right? So if you're trying to lift a rock that's 100 pounds an inch, and you had a big long lever that you could move 100 inches, then it would only take a pound of force on the end of that lever. So that is how levers can work to our good. However, when we're lifting weights, the lever arms of our bodies are actually working kind of against us. So like if you're trying to use a lever for mechanical advantage, you want it to be as long as you possibly can. However, when the force is acting against you, with the lever being your femur, for example, in this case of the squat, then when that lever is the longest, that is actually bad, right? That's where it feels the heaviest. So how we experience this when we squat is when our femur is parallel to the ground, then technically that is when the lever is longest, right? Because gravity always pushes straight down, And so when we're at sort of an angle, the gravity is pushing straight down over a shorter distance because of that angle. But when there's no angle, the distance is greatest, and that's when the force is going to technically feel greatest. Now, what we've already discussed is that a competition standard squat is when the hip joint passes below the knee joint. And so you're going to get to that point where it's very heaviest, and then you're going to keep going. And then to do that squat up, though it's only a small bit, you're actually going to get progressively heavier as you go back up to that parallel and then go beyond, right? So the sticking point is going to be when your femur is at parallel. And so really what you want to try and do is focus on that bottom part and really try and explode out of the bottom and make it through that bottom or through that parallel portion, because that's where it's going to feel the heaviest. And then if you're able to get past that, it should be smooth sailing from there, and it should just be easier and easier all the way up. Some people experience things like that differently. You know, we're going to talk about that same phenomenon that I just described with our arm and our leg lengths with some of our other lifts, and some people just feel differently. Some people really struggle at the tops of lifts and not at the bottom. Some people really, really struggle at the bottom, and then as soon as the bottom's over, they're home free. But that is hypothetically how it should be on average. And again, like I've said, with everything so far and for everything that I'm going to continue to go over in this episode, think about it, apply it to yourself. Experiment during your warm-ups and things, and apply these principles bit by bit. And then hopefully, as you experiment with yourself using these principles, you'll be able to get these lifts as best as you possibly can. Now, moving on, let's talk about the ankle joint, actually. The ankle, for many people, is not very flexible. So if you talk about like stretching your calf, so your toes would come up towards your knees, towards your shins, many people struggle with that. Many people do not have very flexible ankles in that regard. Now, that can actually be problematic on our squat because, as we've talked about, you do that triple extension as we go up on a squat. So that just means that your ankle and your knee and your hip are all going to straighten out. It's the opposite of that when you come down. So as you're coming down on your squat, your ankle is going to bend slightly, but it can only bend as far as you are flexible. And so if you had a very, very not flexible ankle at all, you would have to lean forward very, very, very far to keep that weight over your midfoot, right? Whereas if you had a more agile ankle, your knees could go further forward, which would also then bring your hips further forward, which means you could have a slightly more upright posture and keep that barbell in line. Whereas your ankles, if they're, not very agile, are going to prevent that. And that can actually be another reason why some people have a big struggle hitting depth, for example, just because they feel like they can't without, falling over, things like that. So that's why you'll sometimes see people squatting with their heels on like a plate or a box. I think some people actually sell like platforms where it's an angled platform that you can stand on. And what that basically does, it doesn't make your ankles more agile or more flexible or anything like that. But when you bring your foot down, then your maximum flexibility of your ankle is going to, in that regard, bring your knee further forward, bring your hips further forward, and help you keep that slightly more upright posture. We're going to go into, in just a little bit, some of the equipment. Squat shoes actually have a slightly elevated heel for that same reason. Now, this is actually how we can kind of get back into that external hip rotation. The more you externally rotate your hips, you might actually be able to avoid some of those issues, right? Obviously, in a powerlifting meet, if you're just trying to hit a PR at the gym, there really aren't any rules. You can squat with your heels up on a plate, or whatever it is that you'd like to do. If you're going to be doing a powerlifting meet, though, nobody's going to let you do that. Hopefully you could invest in these shoes or whatever. But really, the solution is to try and make your ankles as agile as you possibly can. Now, that's hard. I mean, your ankles of all things are not as easy to make more flexible than perhaps your hamstrings, some people, bend over and touch your toes. Can you do it? Well, then you have pretty flexible hamstrings. And if you can't do it, that's something you can work up to. Your ankles might be a little harder. One thing that I have heard and tried out, I don't know the scientific backing behind this, but is I heard that if you stretch out your big toe, it can actually kind of help your ankle become more agile, kind of release some of the tension or whatever in there. Again, that is not super scientific of me, but I did try it. I kind of liked it. So if you really are having trouble with your ankle flexibility, perhaps that is something that you could try. But just know that really your ankles come into play more than perhaps you might think. That can actually be, again, like I said, a big reason that people don't feel like they can hit depth. Because, if your ankles are not very agile, then you have to lean over really, really far forward to keep that weight over your midfoot. You might just feel like you're falling backwards if you're not able to do that. And it can really, really be tough and frankly a little dangerous if you're having to worry about that. So whatever your solution is going to be, ideally we kind of fix the root of the issue, which is the ankle itself. But you could wear a squat shoe, or you could lift on a heel or a platform, or a plate, a 45-pound plate on the ground, whatever it is that you'd like to do. Just keep that in mind, and then hopefully we can think about that as we continue to go on. The next thing I want to talk about is our squat cues. Now, some of you might be saying, what does he even mean by that? What is a cue? And a cue is just something you focus on mentally, something that, as you're getting ready to perform your lift and your exercise, just something that you're paying mental attention to, and you're making sure that you are, maybe engaging a certain muscle or getting your body into a certain way. And then just thinking about these cues can just kind of help set you up for success. So that is a cue. It's something you think about, and it's like your pre-flight check if you're like an airline pilot, right? There's a certain list of things you need to make sure are all good before you take off. And so for your squat, for your bench, for your deadlift, there are similar things. Now, I'm going to talk about some of the cues that I know of and that I use myself. But one thing that you should keep in mind is that you don't want to have too many cues. It is totally possible to have too many. Because again, if you have, hundreds of pounds of weight on your back, and then when you step off from the rack, you have this big laundry list of things that you need to make sure are all taken care of before you're actually just going to do your squat or your bench or your deadlift or whatever, you're going to waste a lot of energy. You're going to kind of fatigue yourself just standing there where you could have used that energy better. So, it's okay to have lots of different things going on and lots of different cues over your life. A good way to do it, I would say, is to pick one or two cues and then just do them over and over and over and over until it's a habit. Because once a cue is a habit, it's not really even a cue anymore. So that should make it a little easier for you. But when you are doing your cues, I guess I should say perhaps as you're learning cues that are not habits yet, you shouldn't have more than 3. If you have less than 3, that's great too, but you should not have more than 3. I would limit you to 3. Now, thankfully for that, for the squat, I really couldn't even think of too many. For one, a lot of cues for all these different lifts are just to be tight all around. But that's kind of, just general. It doesn't really mean anything to be tight. All that kind of makes you think about is just activating all your muscles, which is a great way to get ready to lift very, very heavy. But anyways, going into specific cues for the squat. One that I really like, still really helps me to this day, is to try and screw your feet into the ground. Now, what you're going to want to externally rotate your feet both ways. Of course, screws go in one way and out the other for your feet. Obviously, we're going to ignore that. I hope that's obvious. You're just going to try and kind of like rotate your toes out, and almost like you're screwing them and tightening them down into the ground. And really what that is going to help you do is activate some of your glutes and get things in a really good tight position where everything's kind of turned on and fired and ready. So that way when you get to the bottom of the squat, everything that you're going to need to activate is kind of already activated. That really is what getting tight means, is just getting everything sort of kind of contracted and kind of turned on. So that way when it comes time, it's ready. and then you're going to have a much better chance being explosive out of the bottom of that movement and lifting well. So think about that. Hopefully that makes sense to you, because it really is helpful to me to try and screw your feet in the ground. Twist them into your shoes until they can't twist anymore, and just keep everything really, really tight and sturdy and solid. Another one that I like to keep in mind, and I actually see this mistake a lot, is to bring your pelvis underneath you. And so a great way to think about that is to either to contract your abdominal muscles, or to think about bringing your pelvis closer to your rib cage. And the reason for that is because, well, the weight is on top of your back, and some people will kind of have their lower back arched out and their pelvis and their glutes kind of out behind them. And I guess it's an overextension of their lower back muscles. And I think a lot of people do that because they know that you do need to extend and isometrically hold your lower back as you do a squat. But when you do it that much, it's actually kind of to your detriment. You want to get your pelvis underneath that weight so that it transfers more directly to your lifting that weight. So bring your pelvis underneath the weight, or you can think of it as contracting your abs, or you can think of it as bringing your pelvis to your rib cage. That's actually what I do. I like to think about, as I'm taking my breath and I'm going to brace into my belt, I like keeping my pelvis and my rib cage close together if I can. And that really just helps put all of that force from your legs into that barbell. On that topic, good cue is to take a big belly breath. For the squat and for the deadlift, you want to take a belly breath. For the bench, you want to take a chest breath. We'll talk about that why briefly. But for the squat and the deadlift, you want to take a big belly breath and breathe and brace really, really hard into your belt. And we're also going to talk about the belt in a little more detail here shortly. But that is what is going to really, really get you that rigid core, in the same way as having your pelvis underneath that load. The more rigid your core is, the better all of that force that you produce with your legs is going to transition into that barbell on top of your back, and you're going to be doing a little better. The last cue I like to think about is actually not before I lift the weight, but as I lift the weight, is when you get to that bottom, I really, really just try and think about exploding and being as fast as I can be in that bottom portion of the lift, especially as I get to that parallel femur point where it's going to be the hardest. Really try and explode and go fast and take a little bit of that momentum from that speed through that sticking point of the squat, so that hopefully you can get over it and your squat will be good to go. One more thing I do want to talk about as well is your step out, your re-rack. I've actually seen lots of funny videos, perhaps you've seen them as well, about people saying, like, when they unrack a squat bar and they're about to do a squat and they're trying to get their foot placement just right, and then it looks like they're doing like a cha-cha dance or something like that, just because it kind of takes a lot of these little micro adjustments for a lot of people to get that just right. Now again, I want you to think about, if you have hundreds of pounds of weight on your back, you don't want to waste a lot of energy, because as you're walking around, you're going to have all that weight on one foot, though, I mean, you're at a lockout and it's for a brief moment, but that can be really fatiguing to try and walk around with that weight. So the best technique that you can do is to unrack it. I like to unrack it with my feet right close together. I don't know why, that just feels good to me. Maybe it's because that kind of gives me a little bit of extra height that makes it a little easier for me to unrack it. But I like to unrack it like that. And then the technique for your step back is to take one big step back, one medium step back, and then one little step back to match your feet. So again, you're going to unrack it and then you're going to take one large step back, then that, say, with your left foot. So that's what I do, is I start with my left foot. It's going to take a big step back, and then my right foot is going to take a medium step, and that medium step is actually going to go a little bit further back than where my large step took my left foot. And then I'm going to do my last little baby step just to match the position of my left and right foot. From there, sometimes I do need to spread my feet out a little more, or maybe I need to rotate them out a little bit more. That's okay if you need to do that, but I would definitely recommend to practice that step out. On every single one of your sets, try and just take it super serious, and even if you're not using a ton of weight on your warm-ups and everything, take it really serious. Try and get your step out really, really good so that you can get into that optimal squat stance without wasting too much energy. Now I want to move on to the equipment that we are allowed to use during your squat. And I'm going to be talking about all the equipment I can think of, starting with knee sleeves. Knee sleeves are very, very common in your squat, and it's exactly what it sounds like. It's just a short sleeve that goes on top of your knee. Now it is a sleeve, it is a tube that you slide on up over your calves and up to your knee. And a lot of times they're pretty thick and very, very tight. There's obviously a little bit of advantage trying to get them to be as tight as they can be. Now the reason we have knee sleeves is, well, there's a few different reasons. First one is just for a little bit of stability to that joint, especially, your knee has things like your patella in there, which is not part of the joint. Think about your elbow. You don't have a patella equivalent on your elbow, which is actually why you can hit your funny bone on your elbow. Fun fact for you if you didn't know that. But say, for example, like if you had a problem with dislocating your kneecaps, some people do, a knee sleeve would actually be like an incredible tool because it kind of just keeps that little bit of pressure and stability on your knee. Now, obviously, most people don't have problems with their patella dislocating and they still benefit from knee sleeves, but it's that same idea, just a nice little hug around your knee to help it keep stable. That's also going to help with blood flow as well, which can be really, really beneficial. And it is going to offer a little bit of elasticity to your joint. So when you get down to the bottom of the squat, if it's tight and everything, it's going to be a little bit elastic and it's going to provide a little bit of force into your knee joint and help you get that weight up. So that can be a benefit of that. Now, it is different though from knee wraps. Now, again, a knee sleeve is like a sock with a hole in it. You slide it all the way up your leg over your knees. Knee wraps is just a long wrap, right? So it's this long piece of cloth and you start it and you wrap it around and around and around. You don't slide it up your leg, you just wrap it around your knees. Now, knee wraps, obviously they are kind of going to offer the same benefits as knee sleeves, but really their benefit and their purpose is elasticity. Their goal is just to act as one huge rubber band that when you get down to the bottom of that squat is really just going to slingshot you up to the top of that squat as best as possible. Now, for that reason, in most powerlifting competitions and federations, knee wraps are banned. You are not allowed to use them. Knee sleeves are okay, but knee wraps are banned. There is a separate branch of powerlifting called equipped powerlifting. It's not one that I really have any interest in. Obviously, lots of people do. But in equipped powerlifting, you are allowed to use things like knee wraps. And, well, their kind of idea is just that they use whatever tools and equipment they can to help them lift as much weight as possible. And, in these equipped meets, people can lift crazy, crazy amounts of weight because they have, these outside external aids, in this case in the form of a knee wrap. One thing that you will continuing on, another piece of equipment that is very common is a singlet. Now, that is pretty much going to be for the same exact reason as your knee sleeve, but it's going to kind of be full body. It's going to include like your hips and your lower back and things. It's going to give you a little bit of stability. It's going to give you some good amount of blood flow and some small amount of elasticity. At all, high level powerlifting meets, everyone is going to be wearing a singlet. It's part of the uniform, kind of. So, maybe there are going to be people who don't prefer one piece of equipment or one piece of equipment. I think when you get very, very high level, most people are all going to kind of want to use everything that they could to their advantage. But the singlets, that's not something that I own. I don't have a singlet. Who knows how much more I could lift if I owned a singlet and used it. I don't know. But singlets are another common piece of powerlifting equipment that offer those same benefits as a knee sleeve. The next thing I wanted to talk about is the belt. The belt is truly the hallmark. When people are getting into powerlifting, the belt is really going to be probably one of the best performance enhancers that you can get. Now, some people kind of use their belts differently than others. Really, the reason that you wear a belt is for your core stability. Now, when we are lifting pretty much any lift, we want our core to have intra-abdominal pressure. We want it to be pressurized like a soda can is a way I like to think about it. Or I have heard, I didn't come up with that, I can't take credit, but it is something that I've heard that makes sense to me, is you want it to be pressurized like a soda can. So like if you had a soda can and it was unopened, it was pressurized, still had all the soda in it, it can actually support a good amount of weight. You could probably step up on it and it wouldn't break or pop or anything like that because of all that pressure supporting the aluminum can. However, as soon as you open it, even if you didn't empty it, if you just opened it and let out that pressure, you go to step on it, it is probably pretty immediately going to crumple and leak soda everywhere and make a big mess. And so that pressure really, really makes a big difference. Now, the reason that we wear a belt is because we want to put that pressure inside of our abdomen, but oftentimes when that happens, it just kind of pushes your gut out. And not to say that you can't always ever lift good if you don't have a belt for that reason. Beltless squatting and deadlifting and everything is a thing, and it's very good, and you do it during your warm-ups. Anyways, when you just get to that super, super heavy weight and you're trying to put this high amount of pressure inside of your abdominal cavity so that you can be as strong as you possibly can, the belt kind of gives you something to brace into. So rather than all of that force just pushing your gut out super, super far, is going to push your abdominal wall into that belt, and then at that point you're kind of going to stop. And again, not always, because belts are only so thick and everything like that, but it's just going to give you something to brace into. For a lot of people, admittedly myself as well, the belt also serves kind of as a lower back protective tool. And it could kind of be because of that intra-abdominal pressure that it does that. But I actually like to sit my belt relatively low on my pelvis so that it kind of is on top of my lower back. And then if I'm able to get that kind of tight on me and then put more pressure into it with my abdominal brace, it kind of keeps my lower back in line so that I don't get injured. I have struggled with a couple lower back injuries in my life, and that's just, to me, the way that it is comfortable to wear the belt. Some people don't like to wear that low, though. Some people actually prefer to wear it really pretty high, almost over their rib cage. And again, that is going to depend from person to person with your anatomy, your mechanics, and everything like that. You really just kind of need to experiment and figure out what's best for you. Now, I have experimented with a more traditional as well as even like a higher placed belt, and for me, it just doesn't feel as good. And maybe that's just because I'm not used to it and I could learn how to get used to it and then perform even better. I do understand that as a possibility, but for now, I really like to have my belt kind of sitting a little lower. And so if you don't have a belt, it's definitely something that I would recommend. There's lots of different types of the belts out there as well. I really just like the ones that buckle. There's lever belts and there are, Velcro belts and all these different things. I have tried them. I don't really love them. I just like a belt. I actually like it to be relatively thin. I've tried some thicker belts, that thick leather, and it kind of digs into me and I don't really like it as much. So I like a thinner belt that conforms to me just a little bit more, but then it's still, well, I don't know, what's my belt? Probably 5 or 6 inches thick or something. I don't know. Or not thick, but wide. Hopefully you understand what I'm trying to say, but I just like the buckle belts. I can get it pretty tight, I think, and then you don't want to get your belt too tight. I really could probably do an entire podcast episode about a weightlifting belt. I never will because that doesn't sound that exciting to me, but you don't want to get it like so tight. The goal of it is not to choke you, but you want to get it tight enough that when you brace into it, you can get a really good amount of pressure. You don't want to choke yourself. You don't want to hurt yourself by getting it way too overly tight, just because that is going to cause you problems. But anyways, the belt, if you're wondering, I don't have any weightlifting equipment, what is a piece of equipment that I should probably focus on getting first? I would say a belt. From there, probably is going to be our next piece of equipment that I'm going to talk about is the wrist wrap. Now, I've mentioned to you the knee wrap, and the wrist wrap is exactly that same thing, except it is for your wrist, not your knee. These are not banned, however. And the reason being is because none of these lifts in powerlifting involve the extension or the flexion of your wrist. Your wrist is just kind of trying to stay in the same place. And so for you to wrap it with something and give it that extra support, it's not, you could say definitely it's going to give you advantage. That's why you wear it. But it's not going to give you necessarily like some sort of a literal advantage in helping move the weight. So it's common to wear wrist straps, definitely on your bench press, which we'll go into, but on your squat, just because as you are bracing and holding, supporting that weight with your wrists, it's so heavy sometimes that for a lot of people, it kind of rolls down their back and really flexes their wrists a lot, and it kind of hurts them. And so for you to wear a wrist strap and just kind of keep your wrists a little better in line, it can be a lot more comfortable and a lot more safe, and just make it a lot easier for you to support that heavy weight on your back. And then the last thing I wanted to talk about are squat shoes. I've mentioned this briefly before as we talked about your ankles and things like that. But a squat shoe has a couple different components. The first off is that it has a very hard sole. Like, I'm talking like it's like a block of wood on your sole. It's not very comfy, not cushiony at all. Of course, most of them are going to have like a rubber on them for grip's sake, and that's going to give you that small bit of cushion. But like, it's not a running shoe. It's not even a walking shoe. It's not very comfortable to walk in. It shouldn't bend very much at all. And the bottom of that sole is actually going to be completely flat. If you go look at your running shoe, it kind of has an arch and it has different, compartments oftentimes just to kind of distribute the load of your running throughout that shoe. But the squat is just going to be completely flat. So that way your base of support is distributed across your entire foot and can be as solid as possible. The next thing, as we've talked about, that it has is the elevated heel. Now, it can be a lot more beneficial than putting your feet up on like a plate or anything, because say if I am squatting with my heels up on a plate, I kind of just have a couple points of contact between my foot and the ground and that plate, whereas I can still achieve that elevated heel with the squat shoe, but then my entire foot is in contact with that shoe and the entire bottom of the shoe is in contact with the ground. So you're getting that slightly elevated heel, but you are receiving the benefit of just, a little bit of extra stability and things like that. And squat shoes are really great for that base of support. Admittedly, I do feel like I need to disclaim this, but I don't use squat shoes just because I have never felt it in my budget to pay for them. They range from probably $90 to $200 to, I'm sure you could find some $500 pair that Olympics uses or whatever. They buy them, but they're a good pair. You're probably going to spend about $100 on. And so I just have never felt to use my budget for that. I squat in Vans, just skateboard shoes. And some people, Tom Platz or whoever is really going to kind of get onto me for that. I think that's not a good idea. And I understand. I'd love to get a pair of squat shoes. Probably coming up for my birthday, I'll get myself a pair. But we will totally see about that. And I just squat in skateboard shoes. And that kind of works well because, again, it has that super flat bottom, so your entire foot is in contact with the shoe, is in contact with the floor. And then it doesn't have that elevated heel, but aside from that, it's very durable and you can get it pretty tight. And so it can be pretty decent squat shoe for you. But squat shoes specifically are always going to be pretty good. Another benefit of squat shoes, this is kind of just a product feature, but they oftentimes have laces and Velcro, and so you can kind of lace it up to a tightness that is comfortable to be in long term, but then right before you're about to go into your set, you can take that Velcro and kind of give yourself that extra little bit of tightness that you really want during the lift, and then go from there. And that's going to be it for the equipment for the squat. Again, that was your knee sleeves, your knee wraps, which are banned, the singlet, the belt, the wrist straps, and squat shoes. And the next thing I wanted to talk about here was our accessories. We're going to start out first with a back extension. Is a huge one for me. I love to do back extensions just because like I said, I have had lower back issues in the past. And so for me, really just working my back extensors, keeping my lower back really strong is crucial for me. And I use it as a warm-up. I use it as a cool down. I really focus on my lower back. Some people don't need to focus on their lower back so much and they still do great. And that's awesome. For me, I'd put it on the top of the list because it's super important for me. If I did no accessories aside from the back extension, I'd probably do a pretty good job at squatting. I could just squat and do back extensions and be good forever. Back extensions for me are huge. But then there are some other things that you can do. Perhaps I should have defined accessory a little bit better. Basically, an accessory movement is some sort of exercise that's going to train the same or individual components of the muscles that are worked during this lift, but without doing the lift, right? So you're training your glutes, or you're training your quads or your calves or your lower back, but you're not training them by doing the squat. They're muscles that are used in your squat, but you're training them just separately from doing your squat. Some common squat accessories are going to be leg pressing movements. I mean, obviously starting with a leg press, you could do a machine leg press, or you could also do like a front squat. Those things are, squats. You're doing that sort of triple extension. I shouldn't say triple extension because that's supposed to be kind of more reserved for like the power sense, like Olympic weightlifting. So perhaps I'll stop saying that. But like your hip and knee extension, right? You're doing a compound leg pressing movement, which is the same as a squat, but you're just doing it a little differently. So if you're doing a leg press, you're going to take a lot of that stress off of your spine. You're not going to do as much spinal loading, but still be able to train your squatting muscles. If you do a front squat, it's going to be kind of the same way. A front squat focuses more on that upright posture, and then just a lot of people, you're not going to be as strong in your front squat as you are with your back squat, so you could still work those muscles. It's a little more quad dominant without as much spinal loading. Another one, of course, you could do is a leg extension machine. So you're just working your quads in isolation. You could do a calf raise machine. I prefer to do a calf raise with a straight leg just because the gastrocnemius muscle, which is the primary outside muscle of the calf, gets trained better in that lengthened position when you do have a straight leg as opposed to a seated position. Whereas the soleus grows better in a seated position, but it still grows when you have a straight leg. So for that reason, I recommend the straight leg because you're going to be able to functionally grow both. Some others you can do is a lunge. Again, you're doing this compound, leg press movement with a lunge. You could do, like I talked about, your Bulgarian split squat. You could do a glute bridge, right? Or so like a hip thrust to work your glutes. You could do things like a good morning, which is again going to be sort of a lower back extension or a glute extension. You can do, one thing I love is a Jefferson curl. That's going to be for your lower back as well. Maybe you've heard of that, but if you haven't, a Jefferson curl is basically, it's actually more similar to like a deadlift, but it really works your back. But what you try and do is work your back in a very safe way. What you're doing is you're literally lifting with your back. But again, you're trying to use a respectable weight and not kill it, but your back is meant to work. So the idea that some people have that whenever you lift weights, you need to keep your back like completely still and never move and always isometric is false. Your back is allowed to move, but we should train it to move properly. Not, you shouldn't do a deadlift with your back, but we can do something like a Jefferson curl. So basically what that is you grab sort of any sort of weight, perhaps a barbell, and then you stand with stiff legs, and then you bend all the way over as far as you can, and then you lift. You try and imagine yourself lifting that weight up like vertebra by vertebra, like individual up, kind of like a chain, just rolling upwards, pulling like each of your vertebrae at a time, and then getting that all the way up and rolling over. So we just going all the way down and slowly lifting by just rolling up your spine, and that's a Jefferson curl. I don't train the Jefferson curl for weights or for progress or anything, but I do commonly use it as a warm-up, and it's something that I value in that regard. Another very, very prudent thing, as I have discussed, are adductors. Your adductors are used during a squat, so you could train your adductors in the adductor machine where you squeeze your legs together. I, again, don't do that because I train my legs, or my adductors, I apologize. I train my adductors as much as I really care for them to be trained in the squat itself, as well as, I don't want too much adductor hypertrophy. I would definitely much rather it for strength, just because, big adductors lead to chafing legs, which is not something that presumably many of you guys are very interested in. So for that reason, I don't train them. But another thing you could train as an accessory to your squat is a pause squat. So it's literally going to be a barbell back squat, but you're just going to pause at the bottom. And so nothing about the squat is different, no form is different or anything, but it's just a different way to do the lift itself. And that's something that you can do for all of the power lifts, your squat, bench, and deadlift. You just kind of play with the tempo and that is technically going to be a form of accessory for your squat. I'd like to take a quick break and thank the sponsors of today's episode. Now, unfortunately, I'm kidding. I do not have any sponsors. Rather, I put on this podcast with my own time and my own money, just as part of my desire to spread high quality scientific information about nutrition and exercise. I promise that if I ever do have sponsors one day in the future, they will be the highest of quality products that I genuinely endorse and would recommend to all of you. But I would like to put in a plug here, as a thank you to the sponsorship of today's episode, some ways that you guys can support this show if you are enjoying the things that you're learning. First thing you can do is subscribe to our show on YouTube or follow on Apple or Spotify or wherever you listen. You can also like the show on YouTube. You can leave the show a rating on Apple or Spotify. You can even leave comments, I believe now on Spotify, though I don't use Spotify. You can leave comments on YouTube. Some of these things may seem silly. I know many creators are always advocating for you to subscribe and follow and comment. But really what these things do is tell the algorithms of these sites that people are enjoying the things that they are learning on these episodes and that they should recommend them to more people. And those are great zero cost ways for you to support this show. You can also send this episode or this show to a friend or a family member who you think might enjoy it. If you are interested in 4 cost ways to support this show, I do offer coaching, both for exercise and nutrition. I focus on general health outcomes, as well as I love working with sport-specific athletes, whether that is you're into bodybuilding or powerlifting, whether you are a runner or a wrestler or whatever that may be. I can help you optimize your exercise and your nutrition protocols for preseason, off-season, making body weight, manipulating body composition, adding muscle, or perhaps making weight and fueling and hydrating properly for a competition or a game day. Again, if you are interested in those, you can message me or comment on this video and I'll be able to get in touch with you there, or you have my information and email is in the description on YouTube. Moving on now to the bench press. I, like many other gym bros, are very fond of the bench press. It's just a very, very fun exercise. Frankly, a lot of people love it because it kind of strokes their ego. They just love to bench press as much as possible. But I say that there is nothing wrong with that. I love the bench press. Starting out, of course, with the mechanics. We know that it is going to primarily work our pectoralis muscles, as well as our triceps. It is also going to work a small amount, again, kind of depending on your personal mechanics, your front delts, so the front of your shoulder. And then in the bench press, it's actually pretty involved with the muscles that you use to set up your base of support. There is leg drive involved in a bench press. You are going to be contracting your back muscles, primarily your upper back muscles, as well as your lower back to support your arch. You're going to be bracing with your stomach. You are going to be trying to be supporting that weight as best as you can with your forearms, your wrist flexors and extensors. There really is a lot going on in a bench press, but the primary muscles are your pecs and your triceps. For some people, a decent amount or a small amount of your front delts, your front of your shoulder. Now, obviously, the bone that is going to be majorly in play here is the humerus. And we kind of go into what we talked about with the squat, that the longer your humerus is, same with the squat is your femur, the longer that bone is, the harder it's going to be, right? So taller guys on their bench press, same with all of these lifts, think about it like this. If their arms are 20% longer than yours, and that is proportional through the upper and the lower arm, well then at lockout, the weight is going to be 20% higher, and so they have to move it further down to get to their chest. And then when they are at that final bottom range of motion, the weight of that bar is going to be pressing on that lever at their humerus 20% further away. So not only does it feel heavier to them, but they have to move it higher up to complete that repetition. So this is actually an exercise where short guys really, really kind of have an advantage. You want to have short arms. But that kind of contrasts with other movements in powerlifting, and that's why, you win some and you lose some. A guy with really, really, really long arms is actually going to do well at the deadlift, but we'll go into that a little bit later. Anyways, those are the mechanics of our bench press. The technique of a bench press, I mean, obviously, sure, I don't really need to mention this. You lay on the bench and you press it to your chest and off. However, for a competition, if you're competing in powerlifting, there are a couple things to keep in mind. First of all, obviously, you do have to get it to your chest. And then to complete the rep, you have to get it to full lockout. But in a powerlifting competition, the bench press also requires a pause. Now, the reason for that pause is because if you didn't require that pause, it's possible for people to kind of use their rib cage to kind of explode up off of, and bounce actually is the right word. They can kind of bounce that weight up off of their rib cage and kind of use the like elastic potential energy just stored in their ribs, which can kind of be dangerous, which is oftentimes the reason that they make rules to work around that, is because they don't want anybody to get hurt. But it's totally possible to bounce that weight off of your rib cage. So in a competition standard, you need to get that weight down to your chest, and then you have to wait for a command from the judges to press that weight off of your chest. Hopefully it's not a very long pause, but that pause definitely does kind of take some pounds off of your bench press when you just do, in the gym, a controlled touch. With that in mind, though, that used to be the only rule, was you had to get it to your chest and wait for the command to press. But then as we talk about the technique, one thing that you want to do is have a sort of an arch in your back. That way your points of contact on the bench is your upper back on your shoulder blades or your traps, and then down to your glutes. And that arch really just helps you kind of push down those 4 points of contact on the bench pretty hard, put a lot of good force and tightness into those, and just give you a really strong base of support. However, there used to be a lot of controversy over how much people ought to be able to arch, because people, especially females, would be able to get to the point, just because females are so much more flexible, where they just arched so high because their backs were so flexible that they could technically take the bar, get it to their chest, and then press back up, but have a very, very minimal range of motion. And so there was just a lot of debate over whether or not this should count as a bench press, because the range of motion is so short, but they still did get it to their chest. So what should we say and what should we think? Well, recently, powerlifting federations have created the rule where your elbow needs to break parallel, right? So your humerus needs to break parallel, I should say. Your elbow needs to get to the point where it kind of is coming below the bench, and that is what considers proper depth. So you do still have to get to your chest, but you also have to get that arm to a certain range of motion. And so that was kind of received angrily to some of those people who, I guess, were using that loophole, just that super high arch and getting it to their chest. But nowadays, that is the rule. You have to get your arms to that certain point of range of motion. And of course, you do need to hit your chest as well. So if you have to go a little deeper than that to hit your chest, well, you have to go a little deeper than that to hit your chest, because it is not just that arm range of motion. It's simply that if your arm does not reach that range of motion, it does not count as a good lift. As we talk about the proper technique and form to do our bench press as best as we can, the first thing that I feel to mention is to stack your joints. Stacking your joints is where we just make sure that they are all lined up underneath each other, and that makes us as strong as we possibly can be. Now, the reason that I say that is because a lot of people, without really even knowing it, sometimes do not have their joints lined up on top of each other, and then that makes them have to do a lot of shoulder internal and external rotation to stabilize that weight, which can both be difficult and dangerous when you're doing, again, hundreds of pounds on a bench press. And so you just want to make sure that all of your joints are underneath each other, and that is actually going to just kind of help make sure that a lot of that weight goes on your bones, which are always going to be a lot stronger than your muscles. So your wrists should be on top of your elbows, and your wrists should be in the same plane as your shoulder joint. And with that, you're going to be just a lot stronger at that bench press. With that in mind, we should talk about the wide versus close grip. Now, this is kind of similar to the squat. We mentioned whether you should do high bar or low bar. And it's kind of the same principles of, well, of that. It's of distances and lever arms. In a bench press, you can bench press with your hands pretty close together, or you can move them a lot further out. And if you think about that, if you have a wider range of motion, it is actually going to take some of that range of motion out. Sorry, I shouldn't say wider range of motion. If you have a wider grip, it is going to take some of that range of motion out, just because as you pull your arms back, they get closer to your chest. And so you can even get your elbows to that point where they're reaching that proper depth, but the barbell doesn't quite have to move as much. But what's the con of that? Hopefully you guys are already catching on to that. It's that then the weight is acting with a much longer moment arm on your chest. And so it is going to feel a lot heavier, though the range of motion is shorter. If we put that in reverse and you do a very, very close grip bench press, well, there's not going to be a very long moment arm on your chest. However, when you get too close, it's actually kind of dominate your triceps more so than other variations of the bench press. But then you also have to move that weight very, very far. So you want to experiment. And that's what I'm going to say again. It's very common to press with your hands just outside of your shoulder width, but really just you need to experiment during warm-ups or when have you, whether you like a wider grip, a closer grip. I think my grip, I don't know if I could tell you like right off the top of my head, but I want to say that my bench press grip is a little bit narrower than most people's. Most people do prefer a wider grip than I do, but it's just, to me, it's what feels strong. So that's what I do. Now, let's also talk about the function of your back and your legs as we talk about this base of support. So leg drive is going to be very, very, very important. Maybe you've tried, some people do it as a sort of accessory or a warm-up, is to do a bench press without their feet on the ground. They just kind of stick their feet up in the air, and it's not always too bad, but definitely the balance is a little bit harder and you're not going to be as strong doing that. Now, why is that? I mean, it's not like our legs are actually contributing to the bench press, but it's two reasons. First of all is balance, right? So if you have your legs on the ground, you're going to be able to balance better as you do this pressing movement. But then the other thing is that the more weight we put into our legs, the more it digs our traps into the bench, and the more our traps are dug into the bench, just the better our support is, right? We have a better base of support to press off of, on our traps and on our shoulder blades as we actually do the press. So don't underestimate leg drive. Obviously, it's not a lower body exercise, so it might seem silly for our leg drive to do so much, but leg drive is really, really a big, important aspect of the bench press. And so it's very, very common to try and warm up and exercise your traps and your back muscles. You probably don't need to warm up your legs with weights, but to kind of stretch them out and make sure that they're feeling mobile is very, very good idea, very optimal for a good bench press. Now, continuing on to talk about leg drive, there's different ways that you can do it. There's three main different ways that you can apply your leg drive. The first one is going to be having your feet as far out in front of you as you can. The second one is going to be having your feet curled back behind you as much as you can. And the third one is the one that I use, is having your feet spread out as far apart from each other as you possibly can. Now, they all function the same. The idea is just to try and put a lot of weight into your traps and into your upper back for your base of support. And they also function to try and keep your butt from coming off the bench. Now, if your butt comes up off the bench, then it does not count as a good lift. Now, this is actually super, super common, and I wish I could tell you why, but I mentioned this in my last episode, but I have a video of the first time I ever hit 225 on my bench press when I was a 16-year-old, and though I did lift it, my butt came sky high off the ground. Like immediately as I got that weight off my chest, my butt just came right up. And really what it is, you're just trying to put, more leg drive, just go as hard as you possibly can so your butt ends up coming up. But then usually what that means is that you are extending your hips and your lower back and your butt comes off. So what you want to try and do is have that good leg drive without your butt coming up off the bench. Now, another reason for, perhaps why does it count as not a good lift if your butt comes off the bench? The reason is because if your butt comes off the bench, then it's going to kind of change the angle of your torso in some ways, and it's going to become sort of like a decline bench press, and it also could be kind of dangerous for you as well. Again, a lot of these rules are actually just put in place so that we can try and keep our athletes safe. Anyways, all of these different methods kind of work the same to, again, put as much leg drive as you can into your traps and then keep your butt from coming off the bench. To have your legs as far out in front of you as you can, it's exactly what it sounds like. You're just put your legs out all the way out and then just like bend your knees down until your feet hit the ground. And then you're just going to try and kick your feet out forward to put weight into your traps. You can do that. Alternatively is to curl your knees as far as you possibly can behind you and then kick outwards. But the reason I don't like that is because you don't have as wide of a base of support. It's very, very narrow. Both of those are. But then especially to have your knees behind, or your feet behind your knees, like curled back there, you don't have as much support, I don't feel like, in front of you, as well as I feel like it's much, much harder for me to keep my butt up on the bench because I'm really in that perfect position for the harder I kick with my knees in that position for my butt to just come right up off the bench. So what I like to do is to keep my butt, on the bench as I'm setting up, and then just to spread apart my feet as much as I possibly can. And that gives me a great bit of balance from side to side, as well as it puts me in a position where it's actually pretty challenging for me to get my butt up off the bench, which is good. You don't want your butt to come up off the bench, and then I can give a really, really solid base of support. I'd say, I guess the con of that is that as you're trying to do your leg drive, it's not so much coming from your quads. It's actually coming in a big way from your adductors and things like that. There's a lot of rotation and adduction of your hip joints that are giving you that leg drive, whereas a lot of people might prefer the others because it's coming more so from your quads. Now, as you are doing your setup for the bench, you get down on the bench. We've already talked about your 4 points of contact on the bench, and then of course you have your feet on the ground. One thing that's very, very common to do is to kind of use the support arms of the bench press to kind of squeeze your shoulder blades together so that you can get them very, very tight, and then just kind of dig in and kind of, get your arch underneath you, put your traps into the bench so that everything is set up nice and strong. The way that I like to grip the bar is something called the bulldog grip. The other grip method you might have heard is the suicide grip. Well, it gets that name for an unfortunate reason, but basically the bulldog grip is just where the bar is resting on. You always want to rest the bar on the meat of your wrist, or not the meat, but I should say the bones of your wrist. You want it to be directly over the bones because bones are strong because they don't contract, they're bones. And the bulldog grip involves having your thumb on the other side so that your thumb blocks it from coming off. The suicide grip, for a lot of people feels a little stronger because you can actually have more of the bar on the bones of your wrist than you can with the bulldog grip. But of course the issue is that there is a pretty serious risk of that bar slipping off of your palm, and then it could really, really cause some damage to your chest, to even your neck and your face if it did fall. Whereas the bulldog grip, you're protected from that, but you might only have the outside portion of your palm on that bar directly over the bones. However, I'm always going to recommend the bulldog grip. To make sure that you are getting that grip right over the bones, wrist straps come in play here. And I'll talk about that again just briefly when you go into the equipment. As you are getting ready to lift off, I like to have the bar directly sort of over my mouth and nose. Some people will say to have it over your eyes, but when you're pressing the bar itself, you actually want to come probably from over your neck and about down to your nipple line. And so the further back that bar is and the more you have to move it down when you're doing your bench press, the more energy you're going to waste. It's going to put you in an awkward position. So I like to have it I want to be able to be as close to that bar as I possibly can. I don't want to be so close that I, risk hitting the rack, or the supports as I'm doing my repetitions. However, I want to be close enough that I'm not wasting too much energy with that lift. So I will pretty much just get it over my mouth or my nose. And then from there, we can also talk about the lift off. So in many powerlifting federations, you are allowed to have a spotter give you a lift off. And if you do have someone giving you a lift off, then you probably don't need to worry about wasting energy because they're helping take some of the brunt of that weight as you get it to where you want it to be for your press. However, I have just gotten to a point where I feel pretty good about where I have it. I'm not using very much energy, and I feel like I have a lot of control over it for me to lift it off by myself. So I don't like to use a lift off in a powerlifting meet. And the reason for that is because as often as I do get a lift off from people, it oftentimes just feels kind of awkward as I try and balance that weight wherever they might let go or set it for me, or it's kind of a shock all of a sudden to have the weight let go from your spotter. So for me, it actually feels stronger for me to just lift it off by myself, and then that's why it helps for me to have it over my mouth rather than over my eyes or anything there, and then just lift it on my own like that. Let's go ahead and go into the cues for the bench press. The first one that I really like is to either try to bend or to break the bar. And the reason that that is going to help you is because it's going to help you engage your back. Now, we've talked a lot about that, the back. Why does it help us to engage the back to bench press? Because the bench press is a chest and tricep exercise. Why does our back matter? And on a bench press, especially, think about it on a deadlift or a squat. I mean, it's your feet that are taking, all of the load and being your base of support. Your feet are used to that. Your upper back and your shoulder blades are not used to that. And so for you to really engage your back and have a good, strong base of support with your back is going to be very beneficial. So the two ways you can think about is to bend or to break. And to bend is to grab the bar and then try and rotate your thumbs upward, like you're just trying to bend the bar in that direction. That's the one that I prefer personally. But the other thing you can do is to try to break the bar. And so what that's actually going to look like is to, just kind of almost like you're doing like a rear delt fly, just kind of pull your arms back. And that obviously is definitely going to help your scapula come together, give you that base of support there. So you can either try and like pull your hands apart from each other to engage your back, or what I like to do is bend and rotate my wrists up. The other cue you can think of is to dig into your traps, specifically in conjunction with your leg drive. That's what I like to do as I'm preparing to unrack my weight, is push a lot of weight into the bar, a lot of weight into my traps, and then I like to push the weight into my traps as I do my leg drive. Like if I was just to do a leg drive without putting weight onto my traps, I'd probably just slide up the bench, lose my base of support and everything that I was hoping to get out of that leg drive. I'd lose my arch and things. And so I like to just push into the bar, into my traps, and into the floor with my legs all at the same time. And I actually probably do that 2 or 3 times just to get ready and get the feel for it before I unrack and I lift. Then, as I've talked about with your legs, you want to try and kick them out. If you're going to have your legs wide and far apart like I do, it's probably going to be more of a adduction and a hip rotation. But so you can just try and kick your legs out for your leg drive. The reason I say kick them out with your quads is what you'd be doing, is because if you just try and like push, then you're probably going to use a lot of your glutes and your lower back, and that's what's going to get your butt off of that bench, which is not what we want. So you just want to kick, and that's going to kind of slide you backwards into your traps. Then, as I've mentioned before, you want to take a big chest breath on your bench press. A chest breath. The reason for that is because if you take a big puff of air into your chest, it is going to limit the range of motion that you need to do to get it to your chest, right? If you take that big breath into your belly as opposed to your chest, you're going to have to come down further than if you did for your chest. Now, of course, that is the antithesis of hypertrophy training. So if that's your goal, then you don't need to do like this. But for powerlifting's sake, for trying to lift as much as you can, you want to take a big chest breath. And then again, we've talked about this cue before, though it's kind of vague and doesn't really count as a cue. You just want to make sure that everything is tight. And so when I'm about to do my bench press, I just always think of my wrists being really, really tight, my elbows being really, really tight, my chest, my shoulders being really, really tight. And then lastly, I like to think about my core as well. I feel like the more I engage my core on a bench press, the better I do in that regard as well. Now let's go ahead and talk about some of our equipment. We've already talked about wrist wraps, and the nice thing about wrist wraps is they just brace your wrists and they help keep your hand right exactly like this and like this, as if, if you're listening on Apple, you probably, or Apple, or Spotify, or whatever, you don't know what my wrist looks like right now. I apologize, but like we mentioned, you want to have that weight right over your bones, and so when you use a wrist wrap, it kind of just locks your wrist into that right position where we can lift as much weight as possible. It's not necessarily the end of the world to not have wrist wraps, but one thing that you will notice, especially if you have a bar that kind of has a lot of, a well lubricated or nice bearings in the bar, it can actually kind of roll, and that can be to your detriment. And if that bar rolls onto the top of your palm, it's really going to be very uncomfortable, kind of dangerous, and just not very good, because then your joints aren't stacked. The weight is not over your joints. It's using a lot of effort and possibly risking a little bit of injury or safety just because the bar is not where it ought to be. Now, there's a lot we can do to train our forearms and everything to take care of that so it's not an issue, but I really, really love wrist wraps. Again, especially as you get to the point where you're lifting hundreds of pounds, these things are great tools. Next thing I wanted to talk about is the belt. Some people really like to use a belt for bench press. I am not one of those people. I don't know. Just never really appealed to me to use the belt. It's never really understood to me because you take a big chest breath as well. Maybe if someone was trying to do more of a belly breath, it might make more sense for them to use the belt. But for me, it doesn't really add any extra help. I'm not bracing like a Coke can into my stomach the same way I am for a squat or a deadlift. And so I don't like to wear the belt, but some people will just wear it and it helps them with their arch. Maybe it helps their lower back feel a little bit better in that big arch if they have one. So it's not uncommon to see people bench press wearing a belt, but that is not something that I like to do personally. As a matter of your shoes, as you're doing a bench press, there's no special shoe that you ought to be wearing, or it doesn't really matter. But one tip that I will give you is that I always find it really, really helpful to wipe the dirt off the bottom of my shoe. I'll go grab a towel and some spray. I wipe the dirt off my shoes. Sometimes I'll even wipe the dirt off the ground, just because it's going to give you as much traction as possible. If your feet are slipping around, you can't really give a good leg drive. Whereas if the dirt and everything off the bottom of your shoes is clean and you get a better grip, it can give you a better leg drive in that regard. Some federations do allow elbow sleeves. It's just the exact same as a knee sleeve, but it's for your elbow. Some don't. That's, again, just for one more time, going to give you a little bit of stability, compression, blood flow, maybe a small bit of elasticity. And then the same way that there are elbow sleeves, there are elbow wraps, which again are banned. But for the bench press, there's actually more. So there's elbow wraps that give you that a little bit of elasticity. And then there's also things called shirts, bench press shirts, and slingshots. And both of what those are is they wrap around your humerus, they go around your upper arm and across your chest, the bench shirt and the slingshot. And then as your humerus moves down, it's just this big elastic band that helps lift up your bench press. Now, frankly, I think these things are kind of comical. Again, they use them in equipped powerlifting, but to me, it just doesn't make sense. People say, oh, it's a different sport, you don't understand, and I guess they're right because I don't understand. But people say, oh, there's a new world record for the heaviest equipped bench press, and it's 1,000 pounds or whatever, but they're wearing this huge slingshot that does so much of it. I don't understand what the appeal of is, where the slingshot meets the human bench presser. But anyways, there is the elbow wraps, the shirts, the bench press shirts, and the slingshots. Those are all banned in traditional powerlifting. In equipped powerlifting, you could use all of them at the same time and just have this huge advantage on your bench press. And then the last thing I wanted to talk about for our bench press are the accessories that we can use. And again, hopefully some of these are pretty intuitive, but the first one that we can do is a tricep extension, as well as like a chest fly. Those are just going to work those muscles in isolation. Going on that same sort of idea of pressing movements we can do with our chest that are just a little different. You can do a close grip bench press. You could frankly probably do a very, very wide grip bench press as a sort of accessory for your bench. You could also do something like a dumbbell bench press as opposed to a barbell. You could do an incline bench press as opposed to a flat bench press. You could do a shoulder press to help work on your front delts, that for many people are going to use, a small component of them. Or you can do a decline bench press, right? There's lots of different things that you can do. You can work those muscles in isolation, as well as you can do variations of the movement itself. So again, you could do a close or a wide grip bench press. You could do an incline or a decline bench press. Perhaps you could do a dumbbell bench press, and those all would be considered accessory movements. Now, one that I specifically wanted to highlight as we talk about these bench press accessories is the dip, and specifically the weighted dip. And you guys, I'm not talking about the one where you put your feet up and your arms are behind you on a bench. I'm talking about the one where you get in a rack, your hands are on these handles, and then you dip your body weight down, and ideally you have extra body weight as well. And what I've noticed is that as you do these weighted dips, you can actually add a tremendous amount of strength to this movement each week. When I was doing weighted dips a while ago, I could add 5 or 10 pounds every single workout. And the reason for that is not actually because I'm getting so much stronger in my chest and in my triceps, but what I love about the dips is that it really, really teaches you how to concentrate your force on this lift. And so when it feels like it's slowing down, you feel like you're not going to get it, you just keep squeezing your triceps and your chest and just keep working and keep fighting. And a lot of times it will go up. You'll be able to get it. And I really, really love this. If you've never done weighted dips in trying to help your bench press improve, I definitely recommend it, because it's just going to teach you how to keep irking out those little bits of motion and getting up and slow. Because for a long time for me, my bench press would either go up or it wouldn't. I'd do a rep and either it would go up pretty fast and pretty easy, or I would get an inch off my chest and not be able to go anymore. There was no amount of, it was a really slow rep and a really tough rep, a really challenging rep for me. It would just kind of either go up or it wouldn't. And what I love about these weighted dips is that it kind of eliminates that, just because it teaches you how to fight on this press with your chest and your triceps. So I really, really love the weighted dip as an accessory for bench. Now, finally, we are going to be going into our deadlift, our last lift. And then, of course, like I said, we're going to go into those studies about those ergogenic aids. Anyways, for our deadlift, of course, this movement is mostly going to be utilizing our glutes and our hamstrings, as well as our back extensors. However, the deadlift is pretty, how do I say this? Pretty versatile. It works a lot of muscles. I've heard a myth, I'm just going to go ahead and call it a myth, going around, a while ago now, but that the deadlift works every single muscle in the human body. That is not necessarily true, and a lot of them are worked kind of isometrically, so they're not really a valuable way to train that muscle. However, it is true that the deadlift does work a lot of muscles. So obviously the glutes and the hamstrings and your back extensors are kind of going to be what is extending and getting the weight up. However, there's lots of support going on here. So first of all, your back and your traps are going to be doing a lot of work just holding the weight up, especially because deadlift, for presumably most people, maybe there's some anomalies where this is not the case, but for the vast majority of people, the deadlift is your heaviest lift of the three. And so just for your back and your traps and your forearms and your biceps, to hold all that up can be a lot of work. Again, a lot of that is going to be isometric. You're not actually getting range of motion, so it's not an ideal way to actually train the muscle, but they do come into play, as well as even your quads, because you start with a bent knee, and then it's kind of I don't know the right word for it, but it's kind of ironic, I guess, because as you are doing a deadlift, you work your hamstrings to help straighten up your back, your pelvis, to extend your pelvis up. But then also at the bottom, you have a bent knee and you're going to kind of be pressing up on it. So it's one movement that acts as a hamstring and a quad exercise, though it is more so your hamstrings, and just your quads kind of play a supporting role there. And then as well, if you do deadlift with a sumo stance, you are going to be working a lot of your adductors. I don't deadlift sumo. If you love to deadlift sumo, that's awesome. For most people, would recommend conventional. Just, I don't know, I guess it's a matter of principle. Technically, I understand that if you want to deadlift as much weight as you possibly ever could, it's going to be done doing sumo, but I just like the conventional deadlift better. The technique for the deadlift, there's really only one rule, and that is that you're not allowed to hitch the barbell. And all it is there's a weight on the ground and you pick it up, right? And you get to full lockout, but you're just not allowed to hitch. That's pretty much the only rule. And what hitching means is kind of like resting it up against your legs, dragging it up against your legs, just because there is, I guess, belief that, that could give you a little bit of an advantage in that you kind of rest it there for a moment. I personally think that there are lots of red lights given at powerlifting meets for hitching on your deadlift that are kind of baloney, because if your bar hits your thighs, that doesn't necessarily mean it's hitching. In fact, it could be like the opposite of hitching, where your thighs are kind of giving a little more resistance to that barbell from going up. But really, a lot of powerlifting judges will just say, like, if that barbell touches your thighs before it's all the way up, then you've hitched. Now, an extreme example of hitching would be where you get that bar up above your knees and onto your thighs, and you kind of squat down under it, and you rest for a second, and then you get it up. There's this video, it's pretty old now, but this guy, he's a very muscular guy, but he's trying to deadlift probably 700 or 800 pounds. It's crazy amount of weight in some commercial gym, and he kind of just is really struggling with this weight, and then he gets it above his knees and he hitches it. And again, it's a gym lift, so technically he can do whatever he wants, but he hitches it on his thighs so that he can rest just a second, and then he keeps trying to pull, but as a consequence of him having hitched it on his thighs, he actually starts leaning back too much, and then he falls backwards. Thankfully, because of the space underneath, the bar that's going to be, occurring on any sort of deadlift, he's okay. I don't think he hurt himself, but then he just starts screaming and complaining that he didn't hit this weight. But it's super funny video. That is an extreme example of hitching, and perhaps an example of why you don't want to do that. And as I've mentioned, one of the reasons that we have so many of these rules are to keep our athletes safe. And so that might be a great example of why they do care so much about hitching, is so that nobody accidentally falls over backwards and gets hurt. From there, we want, very similarly to our squat, we want the bar to be over our midfoot. That's going to be our base of support. And as you are setting up your deadlift, you want to get to the point where the bar is over your midfoot, and then keeping your back neutral in the position where you'd like it, you're going to bend over to the point where you grab the bar, and then you're just going to drop your hips down and bend your knees until your shins hit the bar. And that should be just about your perfect deadlift form. At that point, you're going to take a big belly breath. Again, you're going to try and get that soda can pressure in your abdomen so that you can just transition as much of that force from your legs into your back, into your arms. The deadlift is, it's kind of tricky. In some cases, it seems a little counterintuitive how it's a leg exercise. Maybe not, but you kind of got to break it down, right? Why are we trying to brace if our legs are below our brace, but then it's our arms that are supporting the weight? So are we bracing for the sake of our arms? Maybe that's just because I overthink it as I think about that. Maybe none of you guys had that problem and I just ruined it for you. But basically, the best explanation I ever got was that your back acts as a lever for your legs to apply the force to the load. So the force is going to be hanging from your arms. It's actually one of the cues that we're going to talk about is just try and have long arms. You don't really want to engage your arms. You don't want to shrug up, because that is going to make, just pull your torso down, and then you're going to have a longer range of motion that you have to lift this weight over. But just trying to have long arms that really are not doing anything. So it's almost just like the weight is hanging from your shoulders. And then the reason that we want to have our soda can pressure in our abdomen is so that our back is tight and strong and can act as a lever for our butt, for our hamstrings to apply that force into that lever up through our arms that are acting as these big ropes where the weight is hanging from, and then get that weight up. Again, maybe I just over-explained that and frustrated you and you have no idea what I'm talking about, but hopefully I'll try and redeem myself. The next thing I want to mention is just the grip. So I do recommend lifting straps. So lifting straps, there's Versa grips, are super common but super expensive, so I've never tried them, but there's also just the standard ones that go around your wrists and wrap around the bar or whatever attachment you're using. I definitely recommend that people work out with these wrist wraps, just because they take your forearms out of the equation, or not even totally out of the equation, but they help make sure that you can lift with your back or with your legs or whatever it is beyond the point of your forearms becoming fatigued. Now, some people will hate on straps and say that, well, you're just going to get weak forearms if you use them. My answer to that is just train your forearms separately, because you're going to be able to better maximize your back or your leg growth if you use these straps. However, for a competition lift, you're not allowed to use straps. In powerlifting, I should say. If you are competing in a sort of strongman event, they do let strongmen use straps. So the world record deadlift, 500 kilograms by Eddie Hall, Hafthor Bjornsson has 501, 502. I like to think that Eddie Hall has the world record, because I don't know if the Mountain has done anything sanctioned. I think the first time he beat it was kind of like in his garage. Anyways, that is not what I meant to get into in this. But in those world record heaviest deadlift ever videos, they are using wrist straps, which kind of makes sense because we care about whether the body can lift it, less so than we care about whether the hands can hold on to it. But in powerlifting, you are not allowed to use straps. You can use chalk, however, you cannot use straps. And so we need to employ some sort of a grip oftentimes to help us hold on to it. If you just held on to it normally, well, then oftentimes what would happen is it would roll out of your hands. Because again, barbells have ball bearings in them and they're lubricated. For stuff like Olympic lifting, that's great. That's exactly what we want, so that we can roll under it and things like that. For lots of lifts, those are good. We want those barbells to roll, but for your deadlift, it's actually kind of frustrating because it could just roll right out of your hands. So you really have to be super, super strong in your forearms to hold up so much weight. And so two different options that you can do. First of all is the hook grip. The hook grip is where you put your thumb in underneath your fingers, and then you just grab on, you kind of hook it with your thumb. It does work pretty well, but it takes a lot of time to get used to. It kind of hurts, frankly. And so it's just something you need to practice if you're planning to use like a hook grip in competition, because it is definitely stronger than just double overhand grip, but it can kind of hurt, and that's really the con of it. The other option is to do the switch grip. So the switch grip just means that one hand is facing the opposite way of the other. Now that is very, very strong, because as the weight might roll out of one hand, that would actually cause it to roll into the other. And so since they would just really be rolling out of each hand opposite ways, it doesn't roll at all, which makes it a very, very strong grip. The con of this is that it is asymmetrical. And so if you're training this, over time, you're going to develop some asymmetries in your body. What I like to do is to do my top 2 sets of deadlifts with the switch grip, but alternate which way I do that switch grip. And then I like to do the rest of my workout with straps. So that way I'm working on my grip a little bit, making sure that I can hold on to the things that I'm deadlifting, but then use straps for the rest of my workouts. It is also worth mentioning that there is a higher prevalence of bicep tears when you do a switch grip on the grip that is facing palm forward. That is definitely a little bit scary. You should be aware of that. I don't necessarily think it's something most people need to worry about, especially not until you get to the point where you are lifting tons and tons of weight. But it is something to be aware of. I like to think that if you just train your biceps properly through a full range of motion and you train those tendons, then you should be pretty in the clear. But that is something perhaps that you just want to know about and be aware of. The last thing I want to talk about is backgrounding. Now, This is not something that I would ever tell a beginner. So if you're a beginner, you have to promise not to listen to anything I'm about to say. But it is not technically the end of the world for your back to be rounded on a deadlift. Your upper back specifically. Your lower back should definitely be at least in a neutral. If your lower back gets to the point where it's rounded, that is probably pretty bad and definitely could lead to some injury, bulge disc, or any bad stuff that you don't want. But your upper back can have a slight bend to it. Almost just think of it as like you're having like this bad, like arched back sort of posture. And then you pull with that until you get to the top, and then you kind of straighten out in the top of your back. That's actually a technique that a lot of people use. And my deadlift looks a lot like that when I do that. The reason I say that I would never tell it to a beginner is because the beginner would take that and probably run with it, and then their lower back would probably start experiencing those issues. They would let themselves, just wouldn't pay as much attention to their lower back and things like that. Probably be a good highway to injury, and that would be my fault. But you need to get to the point where you kind of understand yourself in the deadlift before you kind of experiment with that and allow yourself to do it. But that is a common thing that I'll see. I've gotten comments like it on my videos and other people's videos, is when their upper back has that little bit of round to it. People are like, oh, that's terrible for you. You're just going to hurt yourself so bad. That's awful deadlift form. I understand where they come from. There's nothing wrong with not doing that either. Like, even if you're a super high level, experienced, heavy deadlifter and you have a totally straight back, like, that's great. I'm not saying that necessarily it's an advantage you're missing out on to have that rounded back, but it is okay to have that rounded back. And actually, now that I think about it, I apologize. I said this was the last thing I wanted to talk about, but I think I kind of want to talk about sumo versus conventional. Now, I can't speak super well on this because I've never done sumo. I don't really know much about sumo. I know a lot about conventional because it's what I do, but I don't know much about sumo. I know that the idea behind sumo is, again, range of motion. Now, what you can think about, it's very similar to everything we've talked about. High bar, low bar squat, close grip, wide grip, bench press, and sumo versus conventional deadlift. If you spread your legs out in a sumo deadlift, you might only have to lift that barbell a few inches to get it to the point where you're at lockout and it counts as a good lift. The moment arm is definitely going to be a lot longer, but sumo is so popular because it's actually not going to make too much of a difference, because you're really just trying to use your glutes, and your glutes are well biased in that position. So for a lot of people, really the idea is just kind of rotate your hips back, squeeze everything together, squeeze your butt up, and then you have it. There's still going to be a little bit of quads. I mean, all the same muscles are going to be worked, though in different proportions. You are definitely going to work your adductors much more in a sumo deadlift than in a conventional. But I just want you to understand the idea behind a sumo. Now, if you train conventional like myself, so I do nothing but conventional, if I were to go and try and do sumo right now, my sumo would be a lot weaker just because I haven't practiced it, right? You're never going to be good at something that you haven't practiced. However, sumo is, at the end of the day, going to be stronger than conventional. Not at the end of the day, I should say, at the end of the year, 2 years, whatever. Just because the range of motion is shorter. There's lots of debates as to whether that counts as a fake deadlift or if it means anything. I don't really care to participate in that. I care about conventional, and I do conventional, but that is why sumo is so popular. The range of motion is so small, and the downsides are actually kind of turned down as compared to some of these other lifts, like just the squat and the bench press. So sumo is very popular for that reason. Let's go ahead and talk about our cues. The first one I want to talk about is just to have long arms. I've already mentioned that, but the longer your arms are, the less range of motion we have. You don't want to shrug your arms up with your traps, because then you've added a pretty decent amount of range of motion to that exercise. I mean, an inch or two, but that definitely means something. And you want to try and have long arms. Think of them as chains or ropes where the weight just dangles from your shoulders, and then you, of course, use your legs and your back to pick it up. Try and have really, really long arms for that sake as well. You don't want to have your hands very far apart. You want to have them just exactly at shoulder width, because that is what's going to help them be longer as well. Another good cue for your deadlift is rather than trying to lift the weight up is to try and push the floor away. That's a good cue because it really helps you use your legs more than your back. If you try and lift it up, it's immediately going to go to your hips and your back. Whereas if you're trying to push the floor away, it's going to be more so using your hips and your legs, which is exactly what we are hoping for. And then the last cue that really helps me is to try and squeeze my glutes together. Pinch the penny is a term that a lot of people will use. Imagine there's a penny in between your two butt cheeks and you're trying to pinch it together so it doesn't drop out or anything. But that just helps me. Even though I do conventional, definitely squeezing your glutes together is exactly how a sumo deadlift works. But even as I lift conventional, really just trying to focus. I know it sounds silly, but really trying to focus on just squeezing and bringing your two glutes together to touch. Really helps me, at least, lift a lot stronger. It's a good cue. And then this doesn't really count as a cue, but I don't really know where else to talk about it. Is when you do a deadlift, you need to pull the slack out of the bar. Now, deadlift bars are kind of meant to be a little more bendy and elastic than things like squat bars. And so all that weight on both sides of your deadlift bar, assuming that you can do a good bit of weight, is going to add a little bit of bend. But when that bar is at rest on the ground, there's not going to be any bend. And so to pull that slack out of the bar is actually kind of, well, for a lot of people, it can be one of the more tricky parts of the deadlift. But really what you want to try and do is preload. So before you really put all of that effort into lifting it, you want to put half the effort, 3/4 of the effort, just a good amount of weight and force and pressure into that bar to try and pull as much of the slack out as you can so that you are in that proper position that you want to be in to do the lift itself. Some equipment that we can use on our deadlift, well, if you think about it, there's really not going to be much going on except for the belt, which we've already talked about before, and chalk, right? You're not allowed to use wrist straps or anything. Again, in strongman, you can use wrist straps, but you can use chalk for your grip, and then, of course, you can use your belt for your brace. One thing that you will actually see a lot of times, though, is for powerlifters to use things like either a long pair of socks or baby powder on their shins. And the reason they do that is so that, the bar slides up easily and doesn't, their shins don't give too much resistance to the bar going up. It's actually can be common for people to scrape their shins going up. And if you have a bar that the knurling on that bar is pretty sharp, you can actually kind of scrape up your shins pretty bad. So it could be beneficial to have like a long pair of socks, or some people just use baby powder to try and help that bar slip right up their shins and not cause any harm to them there. Though I guess that doesn't necessarily count as equipment. You will see some people wear a deadlift shoe. And a deadlift shoe is actually just like a fancy grippy sock. And so that's what I wear, is I prefer to wear grippy socks. Basically, you don't want to wear a squat shoe. You definitely would never want to wear a squat shoe doing a deadlift, because that elevated heel is going to add to the range of motion to where you have to pull that bar off the ground. Really, you want to just be like barefoot or in a sock or a grippy sock, right? A deadlift shoe. Deadlift shoe is pretty much just a sock with a little bit of grip on the bottom. You're exactly right on the ground. You're trying to limit that range of motion as best as you can. Again, you can use your belt for your brace, and then your powerlifting singlet if you have one as well. Then lastly, for our accessories that we can use for our deadlift, first, a great one is going to be a hamstring curl. Another one that is, kind of compound, but it is a RDL, a Romanian deadlift, or a stiff-legged deadlift. That is going to help work our hamstrings as well in the stretch position, the lengthened position, as well as it can kind of work your glutes. I guess a word on hamstring curls. I prefer to do hamstring curls seated, because that is going to lengthen your hamstrings a little better, and muscles grow better and get stronger better from lengthened positions. So the line, I love that little bit of science in terms of your hamstrings, because I don't know why, but I hate to do lying down hamstring curls. I don't like them at all. And so the fact that the science has shown us that they grow better at a seated hamstring curl, to me, is awesome, because that's what I prefer to do anyways. I mean, frankly, I don't know why, I just hate the lying down hamstring curl. even if the science said that was better, I probably just still wouldn't do it because I just really don't like it very much. But seated is better, which is awesome, and I love that. Back extension we've already talked about. I do those pretty religiously because I have had back issues and I want to prevent that. We also talked about, some of these are very similar for the squat. You can do a hip thrust for your glutes. You can do the good morning. You can do the Jefferson curl for your glutes and for your back extensors. But then for your deadlift, a great thing to do is grip work. So you can hold on to the bar stronger, as well as things like shrugs and upper back work are just going to, because you use those muscles as you're doing a deadlift. And just training them is going to maybe not help you deadlift more perhaps, but it's going to help you be a little more robust and durable as you do that deadlift training. Now, with those 3 lifts being done, I want to move into this last portion of the episode where we talk about these ergogenic aids. An ergogenic aid is something that is meant to improve your physical performance. And so whether it be a technique or whatever, a supplement, something that is supposed to help you perform better physically. So I wanted to talk about 3 specifically, whether or not there's any validity to whether we should use these or do these practices in conjunction with powerlifting, our squat, bench, and deadlift. Specifically, the 3 that I wanted to go over, I have a study for each of them. The first one is ammonia smelling salts. The second one is music. And the third one is psyching up, hyping yourself up before you go and do a lift. Maybe you are and maybe you're not familiar with ammonia smelling salts. If you're not, totally go Google it and then you're going to find some video. Basically, it's this guy, he inhales this thing, whether it's a snap tablet or whether it is out of a little pill jar looking thing. It's ammonia. And you smell in the ammonia, it kind of burns your nostrils alive. I've used it a couple times before. I've never bought any, but I've used it before. And it supposedly helps you, focus and hype yourself up and be just a little more stronger. And that's how they market it, at least. It just kind of helps with your strength, your energy, and your focus. Now, I wanted to see if there was really any validity to how much these ammonia smelling salts can do for us. And as I went to go research this, it was actually very hard for me to even find like human trials on these ammonia smelling salts. Now, ammonia smelling salts actually used to, I believe it's outdated now, but they used to be used to wake people up from unconsciousness. So if somebody, fainted, or I think back in the day in like boxing fights, if somebody got knocked out, they would use these ammonia smelling salts to try and wake them up. Nowadays, the only thing I've heard them used for, again, if you didn't know, if I've heard in past episodes, I work as an EMT and a firefighter. The only thing I've ever heard them used for is, we don't carry them on our ambulances, but other ambulances do, and they have them in the hospital. Sometimes people will have what they call a pseudo seizure, which basically is where someone is pretending to have a seizure. So they kind of just close their eyes and they go, pretend to have a seizure, though they're just faking it. And so what they'll do, if the medical provider, they can do, perhaps it's a little unethical, but if they suspect a pseudo seizure, they will give this person an ammonia smelling salt. And if it was a real seizure, it wouldn't faze them at all. They would have no idea it was right in front of them. But if it's a pseudo seizure, it burns their nostrils alive and they start coughing and moaning and groaning at this ammonia. Anyways, I wanted to see if there were trials about ammonia inhalation and physical performance. And I found one study, believe it or not. On all of PubMed, I found one study. Now, this study does reference other studies, so studies that it references, I don't know where necessarily to find them, if not on PubMed or Google Scholar, but the name of this study is Elevated Arousal Following Acute Ammonia Inhalation is Not Associated with Increased Neuromuscular Performance. Now, that kind of says all you need to hear there, doesn't it? Ammonia inhalation is not associated with increased neuromuscular performance. But of course, let's go ahead and get into it. First of all, it kind of explains that the reason ammonia inhalants are believed to work is, well, it says it's believed that ammonia inhalation triggers the trigeminal nerve via chemoreceptors within the nasal, oral, and pulmonary mucosa. The respiratory and vasomotor centers within the medulla oblongata respond to this irritation, promoting inhalation reflex and increased blood pressure, leading to elevated respiration and heart rate. As they got into this trial, first of all, they used non-resistance trained male participants, 14 of them. And actually, in my last episode, I kind of talked about how that kind of is an issue with a lot of the studies that we read, is so many of them are non-trained. The reason that they use non-trained people in so many contexts is because it's easier for new weightlifters, those who are new to resistance training, to make more sizable gains in a portion of time. And so any differences between protocols are likely to be kind of exaggerated, more so that we can see them in these untrained lifters. And it's actually kind of a similar idea for this study. They wanted to have people who were not resistance trained because they're not used to stimulating themselves for the sake of maximal performance. So they believe that if ammonia was to have a genuine effect on these individuals' performance, it would be better and more easily seen through non-resistance trained individuals. In this study, they had 3 trials. Every participant, they performed a control trial first, which is all they had them do was take a sharp inhale through the nose. And that was it, just with room air. And then perform, in this study, they did knee extension and hand grip, maximum voluntary contractions. So they would just squeeze a hand grip dynamometer, and then they would, they have these special machines you get seat belted into to do a maximum force knee extension isokinetic dynamometer machine. And it just measures the amount of force production that these people are able to produce from the knee extension and from the hand grip. They also had them do a counter movement jump exercise. And well, they measured a variety of different things. And they measured things like the participants' subjective feeling of alertness. They did also measure the participants' heart rates as well as their perceived level of performance. And what that means is just how well do they think that they did at this exercise. So, for example, they would, just take a sharp inhale and then squeeze the dynamometer or whatever, extend their knee into the dynamometer as hard as they could. And then they would say, how well do you think you performed? And, presumably lots of people at the control are going to be like, I performed as well as I would have because all I did was take a deep breath of air. But then they had, for the second and third trials, they had one was a sham, which is kind of like a placebo, but it's not a placebo because they obviously know it's not ammonia. They used a water sham, but they wanted them to inhale something. So they had them inhale just from like a cup of water to see if that would do anything. So again, it's like a placebo control, but it's not the same as a placebo. And then they had them breathe out, or they had them breathe in ammonia. And whether or not the ammonia was on the second or the third trial was randomized between the participants. And what we found was that the change in the perception of performance from the control condition was higher after using the ammonia inhalants, as well as the heart rate did increase and the perceptions of alertness did increase. However, the peak power production for every legitimate outcome of neuromuscular performance, power generation, peak power, average power, everything, nothing was affected. They were all unaffected by the ammonia inhalants. And so they just kind of talk about it in the discussion, enhanced levels of alertness, might explain the popularity of this supplement, the level of alertness and the perceived level of, how well you did, the level of exertion, those all changed significantly. And so it is definitely likely that those are why these things are so popular, as well as they mentioned that these ammonia inhalants might be able to do a good job at offsetting some of the decreases in physical performance associated with fatigue, more so endurance, because they could help increase your heart rate and get some better blood flow to the muscles. But as we think about ammonia inhalants with powerlifting, does not appear that there really are any benefits to using them. Now, that being said, the thing that does work to improve your performance is adrenaline. And so if, for you, ammonia inhalants help you with your adrenaline, then that's good, and you should use them if you want to. There might be risks involved with inhaling ammonia, especially if you're doing it frequently. However, though the ammonia in and of itself does not appear to help, if you use it as a psychological tool to help get yourself hyped up, then perhaps it could work. Next thing I wanted to talk about was music. So this is a study called Effects of Preferred versus Non-Preferred Music on Resistance Exercise Performance. This is from Samford University in Alabama, copyright of 2019. I like this a lot. Their study design was kind of cool. What happened is they took their, I believe, let's see. They used resistance-trained males in this study. I was trying to decide or remember whether or not the study group, I apologize, was from this one or the next one. It was the next one, so I apologize. They used resistance-trained males, 12 of them, between the ages of 18 and 24, recruited to participate. And what they did in this study is they gave them a survey of different music genres and songs, and then they had them rate their favorite and their least favorite genres. And then they randomly selected one of the Billboard top 10 songs from that genre for this person, and then they tested their bench press strength for the person who had, or using the song that was selected from their favorite genre versus for their least favorite genre. So they had them determine a 1 repetition maximum. They had 4 attempts and would slowly increase the weight until, the person, either their 4 attempts were finished or they were not able to do the weight. They had 3 to 5 minutes rest. They determined that 1 repetition maximum, and then they had the people do as many reps as possible with 75% of that 1 repetition maximum, either during their preferred song or their not preferred song. And I want to show you this graph for all those in YouTube. It's funny. Look at that. Yeah, that top one right there. You can see it good, right? The one on the right there, where there's that huge difference between the 2 bars, is the motivation, the self-reported motivation of the athletes as they performed that maximum reps of their 75% 1 rep max. And there's a huge difference. They were incredibly not motivated at all during the song that they hated, which makes sense. But then they were much more motivated during the song that they liked. And there was a smaller difference between the actual amounts of repetitions. But it went to show you that there was a difference between the amount of repetitions that they could do with the music they preferred and did not prefer. So on average, they completed 10.5 reps of their 75% 1RM with the music they preferred, and they did 9 reps, 8.9 to be specific, but we'll call it 9 reps with the music that they did not prefer. So they improved on average 1.5 reps, which is pretty meaningful. And then, let's see. Maybe I'm thinking of the next one. I am. I apologize. I was trying to find how much their 1 rep max went up, but this was for the next study that I'm going to be talking about psyching up. It was not for this one. Okay, well, that's what we're going to get out of this study, is that 1.5 reps on average was the increase in their endurance and their ability to press 75% of their 1 rep max. With the music choice differences and just for kicks, their motivation level from 0 to 100 was reported at 19 out of 100 with the music they did not like, whereas it was reported at 80 out of 100 with the music that they did. So this definitely goes to show you, and I don't think anybody's surprised to hear it, that music definitely can help you perform a little better at the gym. It is definitely a good ergogenic aid in that regard. I actually did a little experiment on myself a while ago. At this point in my lifting career, I could deadlift 365 pounds for 8 reps, and I knew that. And so the next week I went to the gym. I wanted to see how big a difference my music made, because I do really like loud music and it really gets me going during my workouts. And I wanted to see how much of a difference it would make. And so I turned on like this nature sounds. It was like a running river and tweeting birds. And I wanted to see how much I could deadlift 365 for. And I was able to do it for 4 reps. So it was half of the reps as I was able to do it with loud music. Now that is super, super, super anecdotal. There could have been lots of different things that, had an impact on that. Maybe the music would have accounted for 2 of those reps, and maybe I was just tired anyway that day. I don't know, right? That is super anecdotal and not very strong evidence, but it just kind of goes to show like music actually can play a huge role in our being able to lift heavy weights. Now this is the one that I kept thinking about. It's the one that I read most recently in my defense, but this is from 2005 from the Journal of Strength and Conditioning Research out of Wales. It is called Psyching Up Enhances Force Production During the Bench Press Exercise. And so this is just talking about the ergogenic aid of trying to hype yourself up and motivate yourself in your head, visualize yourself doing a lift, stomping on the ground, yelling, whatever it's going to be. In this study, they took 12 men and 8 women, and they had to have at least 1 year of strength training experience. So they perhaps were not super experienced athletes, but they were resistance trained athletes. And then they put them through 3 different psych up, different trials. So one was called a free choice psych up, one was called a distraction control, and one was called an attention placebo control. Those orders were randomized, and I'll explain what those mean. So the free choice psych up is the psych up. That's kind of the one that we're hoping to see the difference on, is how well they're able to do when they have the free choice psych up. So the instructions given to these athletes was, they gave them 20 seconds to kind of think about how they were going to psych themselves up. And they said, I will now give you 30 seconds to psych yourself up using any method you like to obtain your best effort. And so they get 20 seconds to kind of think about how they're going to do it. Then they get 30 seconds to do it, and then they perform. The attention placebo control is, basically, without psyching them up, they wanted to give them some way that they would suppose that they would do better. And so basically what happened in this is they told the participants that when somebody is aware of their own physiology and their own arousal, that they are able to do better at physical performance. And so they asked them to estimate what their heart rate was, and basically the idea, they were lying to them, right? But they basically got these participants to think that if they were able to predict their own heart rate well, then that would mean that they would perform well physically. So they had the participant estimate their own heart rate, and then they lied to them and said that they were very, very close. They were within like 2 or 3 or 4 beats per minute of what their heart rate was, to try and think that they were in touch with their physiology and were going to do well, and that was their kind of psych up, in that regard. And then they had a distraction control, where basically they were distracted from the lift, so they were not able to psych themselves up in any way. So this was their control in that regard. And so what they told them to do was to count backwards from 1,000 by 7. So 1,993, 986, 979, 972, 960. Anyways, that's kind of a difficult task to do. And so they had them do that for 30 seconds to distract them and not be able to hype themselves up, and then do their bench press exercise. Now, this is the one that I was thinking of as I was looking around that last study for it about music. But what they decided is that a increase from psyching yourself up of 2.5 kilograms was the lowest meaningful difference, because that's about 5 pounds. And so if someone was able to improve, they used a dynamometer, a bench press dynamometer machine for this. Basically, like if someone was able to improve their 1 rep max by 5 pounds, that would be meaningful to them. And so on average, the 1 rep max of this group was 70 kilograms. And so at 2.5 kilograms would be 3.6% of their 1 rep max. And what they found was that after they did the free choice psych up, they had an 11.8% greater 1 rep max than the distraction control. and an 8.1% increase in the attention placebo control. So that is probably, 7.5 to 10 kilograms in addition to their 1 rep max from these different types of controls. And there were differences in men and women because there were 12 men and 8 women. So for example, the men did actually better at the distraction than they did the attention placebo, and the women did worse at the distraction than the attention placebo. They did better at the attention placebo. And so they kind of talk about that a little bit in the discussion, but to me, that's not really, I don't care about the psychology of men and women as they psych themselves up. But what I think is cool is that we did see very meaningful changes as they psyched themselves up and as they listened to good music that they liked. We did not really see very good differences with the ammonia smelling salts. And with that, again, I'll say, do what works for you. Adrenaline works. If music works to get your adrenaline up, if yelling and stomping and screaming works to get your adrenaline up, if smelling salts work to get your adrenaline up, whatever it might be, that is going to help you lift more. I thank you for joining me on today's episode. Again, we talked about our squat, bench, and our deadlift. We talked about some of the biomechanics, talked about the technique of both the rules of how to have a good lift, as well as some of the technique that you can do to make sure your lift is as good as possible, some cues that you can use to help yourself have good form and lift well, some of the equipment you're allowed to use, as well as some of the accessory exercises you can use to train these exercises. Again, in episode 5 of the podcast, we talked about some of the principles of periodization, some of the principles of hypertrophy and of training. If you would like to listen to that, that episode and this episode are going to go very well together. I would encourage you to listen to that episode as well. But I thank you for joining me on today's episode. This has been the Science of Sports Performance.